When you hear the term Pearl Harbor, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it a historic event in world history or a fun-filled water park? No, wait, that's not right either. Well, if you thought of the former, you're correct. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. The attack, which involved over 350 aircraft, was intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and prevent interference with Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. And while the attack did manage to destroy much of the U.S.'s Pacific naval fleet, it failed to accomplish its ultimate goal. But that doesn't mean everything went according to plan for the Japanese either. In fact, there were a few big mistakes made during the attack that could have turned the tide of the war. So today, let's take a look at some of those mistakes. But before we do, make sure you hit that like button for more videos. Mistake number 1, not destroying the repair ships. When planning an attack, one of the most important factors is knowing your enemy. In this case, the Japanese knew the United States had recently enacted a trade embargo against them in response to their aggressive expansionist tendencies. As such, Japan's military leadership assumed the U.S. would not be sending any reinforcements to Hawaii anytime soon. This assumption allowed them to drastically cut down on the amount of time they gave the base to get ready for the attack. However, what they didn't know was that the U.S. Navy had already begun repairing many of the ships that had been damaged by the Japanese earlier in the year. For example, USS California and USS West Virginia had both been damaged during the Battle of Manila Bay and were being repaired at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Had the Japanese known this, they might have waited just a bit longer before launching their attack. Unfortunately for them, they didn't, and both of these ships would end up being sunk during the attack. But while they may have been unable to do so at the time, they would later manage to repair many of these ships, helping to get the U.S. back up to full strength. Mistake number 2, not targeting the airfields on Ford Island. One of the main reasons the Japanese were able to catch the U.S. by surprise was because their attack came totally out of nowhere. If the U.S. had seen it coming, they likely would have been able to mount a much stronger defense. In fact, they almost did. Earlier that morning, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and his team of intelligence analysts had managed to decipher a Japanese naval code that revealed information about an upcoming Japanese attack. However, when the team tried to send this information to General Walter Short, it was ignored. You see, Short had received similar intelligence the day before, and it had all amounted to nothing. So he assumed that today's report would be the same. As a result, the U.S. wasn't fully prepared when the attack began. Had they been ready, though, it would have been much more difficult for the Japanese to achieve their goals. And that brings us to our next mistake, not destroying the fuel tanks. In order to launch an effective air attack, you need two things, planes and fuel. Of these two, the most crucial is fuel. Without it, your planes are pretty much useless. Knowing this, the Japanese military made sure to bring along plenty of fuel for their planes. In fact, they brought so much fuel with them that they even left some of it behind after their attack. But this wasn't because they didn't want to waste fuel. It was because they hadn't accounted for how much fuel the American bombers would use trying to take off from the ground. You see, the Japanese had planned to capture several of the U.S. airfields on the island and use them as their own. But they didn't take into account that the U.S. pilots would be able to use their airfields one last time to take off and bomb the Japanese fleet as they sailed away. This is exactly what happened, and it ended up costing the Japanese the war. Mistake number 4. Not destroying the American aircraft carriers. As we mentioned earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was extremely effective. And that's largely because they focused their attacks on the areas where they knew the U.S. kept its ships. However, this also meant that they neglected to attack the U.S.'s aircraft carriers, which were vital to the U.S.'s ability to project power throughout the Pacific. At the time, the US had 8 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet, but only 5 of them were at Pearl Harbor. These included the USS Lexington, USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. With these carriers, the US would be able to quickly deploy large numbers of aircraft to any location in the Pacific, allowing them to effectively control the seas. However, the Japanese didn't realize this at the time, and they would soon come to regret that oversight. You see, while the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating, it didn't completely destroy the US's ability to fight back. In fact, it did quite the opposite. The attack galvanized the American people, and they overwhelmingly supported the US entering the war. As a result, the US began building new ships and aircraft carriers at a rapid pace, and by 1943 they had replaced all 5 of the carriers they lost at Pearl Harbor, and then some. Mistake number 5. Not killing all the survivors. After the attack began, the Japanese pilots had a chance to deal a death blow to the US by targeting the hospitals on the island. You see, the Japanese knew that the hospitals were full of wounded US servicemen, and if they destroyed the hospitals, they would effectively end the US's ability to wage war in the Pacific. However, for reasons that are not entirely clear, the Japanese pilots didn't target the hospitals, allowing many of the wounded soldiers to survive. While this may have seemed like a simple oversight, it would ultimately prove to be a fatal mistake. You see, the surviving soldiers would go on to play key roles in winning the war. For example, one of the survivors was future President George H.W. Bush. Another was famed pilot Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier. And still another was actor and activist Tom Selleck. Had the Japanese killed all of these men at Pearl Harbor, it's unlikely that the US would have been able to win the war. Mistake number 6, not sending reinforcements. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military began to receive reports that the US was sending reinforcements to Hawaii. Despite this, they failed to send any reinforcements themselves, and this would ultimately prove to be a fatal mistake. You see, while the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating, it didn't completely destroy the US's ability to fight back. In fact, it did quite the opposite. The attack galvanized the American people, and they overwhelmingly supported the US entering the war. As a result, the US began building new ships and aircraft carriers at a rapid pace. And by 1943, they had replaced all 5 of the carriers they lost at Pearl Harbor, and then some. Well, that's all for now. But if you want to learn more about World War II, stay tuned.